Good morning and welcome to the little apartment on the prairie. We are having quite a tragedy here today because Isaac has lost his Kong. Now normally we have multiple Kongs around here, but eventually, he's a pretty strong chewer. He's like a power chewer, and eventually he chews them too much and pieces of rubber start breaking off and you have to throw them out. So we were down to one Kong and it has to be in the house somewhere. It doesn't go outside, but I can't find it. So we have Mr. Pickle, which used to be bright green, but he's kind of old and faded. It's a weird dog toy, but it's got these grooves. You can stick little treats in it, or you can put peanut butter in it. And that's what we're doing. And it is not as good as a Kong, Isaac will tell you, but we've got to make do. So we were down to our last Kong. Usually we have a few, but we're down to the last one. And I normally do like a kind of large order on Amazon at the beginning of every month. I get a lot of vitamins and I get Isaac's supplements for his arthritis and stuff. And so I was waiting until the beginning of December to order more Kongs, but that was clearly a mistake because then he lost one and we're out. So, and Amazon sometimes is out of the Kong Genius, which is the style of Kong Isaac likes. I don't know why. Sometimes they have it, sometimes they don't. So then we have to order it on Chewy, but we get free shipping on Amazon because I have Amazon Prime. By the way, if you all don't know this about Amazon Prime, if you receive food stamps or Medicaid in any of the 50 states, you can get Amazon Prime for half price. So it's awesome. Anyway, so we have Amazon Prime and get free shipping, but with Chewy, you have to order $49 worth of stuff to get free shipping. And sometimes I just order 49 Kongs, which is what I did today, which came to $48 and some cents. So then I had to get a cat toy because I couldn't wait until, where's a dish rag? I'm trying to wash dishes and I can't find a dish rag. So, yeah, because I couldn't wait until until the beginning of December to order Kong, because it's like when your kid doesn't have their favorite toy or their blankie or whatever and they can't go to bed. It's going to be a rough 2 or 3 days before we get our Chewy order, I'm telling you. Okay, so now that's out of the way, but I did want to, while I was talking about Amazon Prime, mention that you do get half price if you receive food stamps or Medicaid. You have to upload a copy of your food stamp card or your Medicaid card, and you only have to do it once, and you don't have to renew it every year or whatever. You just get it at that price for as long as, until you tell them you don't get food stamps or Medicaid anymore. And I'm not suggesting that if you stop getting those things that you should keep getting the deal, but I'm just saying it's easy. You don't have to submit a ton of paperwork and you don't have to resubmit it every year. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about today was homesteading, because on Thanksgiving, what Isaac and I did was we went hiking at Homestead National Monument, which is really, it's a park that's, it's about 45 minutes to an hour west of where I live, and it is the site of where the first homestead was in America. Now, when they say the first homestead, what they mean is the first guy who actually, through the Homestead Act of whatever year that was, 18-something, where you could homestead and get free land if you lived on it for, it was 3 years or 5 years, I don't remember. I'm not good with the little details like numbers. I'm not a numbers person, but I can tell you the story. So anyway, certainly there were pioneers out living on the prairie and in the forest and whatever, doing things that we would consider homesteading today. But the Homestead Act gave people free land. Initially, it was 160 acres. And then later, in some parts of the country, they made it more because where the land was not as good, it was harder to farm enough to make a living on 160 acres. In some areas, people needed more. But that was considered kind of the amount of land you would need to make a living on as a farmer. And also that one family would have a hard time even farming more land than that, because that was back in the 1800s before, you know, when you had to have equipment that was pulled by horses, plows and stuff that were pulled by horses. And when they started creating like steam tractors and stuff, then it was easier to farm a larger amount of land. But in the beginning, you could only handle so many acres because you had to do it with horses and, you know, with your own blood, sweat, and tears. So anyway, so there were people out on the prairie and other places that basically, you know, you just found land and lived on it and built your house where you liked and planted your crops and raised your livestock and whatever. There were people doing that before the Homestead Act. But the Homestead Act said that the government would give you a certain amount of land, and all you had to do was live on it for a certain number of years, and you had to do what they called proving it up, which meant you had to do specific things like build some kind of a dwelling. You had to plant a certain number of acres. There might have been some other things, or things you had to do. You couldn't just have the land and, like, you know, live in a tent on the land and do nothing. You had to do stuff with the land. And they did that because they wanted people to move west and to, you know, populate this new land. They wanted people to farm. We needed more produce and, you know, the goods that they would produce. And they wanted immigrants to come from other countries, not just people from the east to move west, but they went over to Europe. People affiliated with our government went over to Europe and aggressively advertised, you know, that you can come to America, you can get free land, it's great land, stuff will grow wonderfully. You know, there was some truth in the advertising, but some of it was probably a little exaggerated. The immigrants were often told, you can settle in a place where there's lots of Norwegians or lots of Swedes or lots of Germans or whatever, so no need to learn a new language, you know, it'll be easy. And of course that wasn't the case, and immigrants, especially in some areas and like in the large cities, were not treated that well. And so it wasn't as great as they were promised. But people came here from Europe to homestead because there wasn't enough land there. There weren't enough jobs. It was hard for a large family, they could only afford a small amount of land. It was hard to feed themselves, let alone make any money off the land they could get. And they came here because they wanted a better life, not just for themselves, but for their children. And so at Homestead National Monument, they have a little cabin, which was actually, they moved it to the park. It was initially like 14 miles north or west or something of where they moved it to, but it shows you an example of a cabin that homesteaders might have built. And in this part of the country, to have a wooden house, even if it was like a one-room cabin, and this one actually had a little loft, so like all the kids, I think they had 5 or 6 kids, the kids could sleep up in the loft, and then the adults had a bed in the main room, and everything was in one room, and that room was probably the size of my kitchen. I mean, it's amazing that people lived in there, but they weren't in the cabin very much. Like, you slept in there and you ate in there and you went in there to get out of the bad weather. But think about in the winter when there was a blizzard or something, or just heavy rains in the spring, you might be trapped in there for several days with your whole family. But most of the time they were outside working on their land. But anyway, we have a shortage of trees in, you know, the Great Plains, and so most people, when they first came here to homestead, they built a sod house. They cut blocks of earth out of the ground, and you had this house with earthen walls and an earthen floor, and the ceiling was blocks of sod. And so sometimes clumps of dirt would fall off the ceiling onto your table or your bed or whatever. And it was very, very dark. They might have one window in the soddy. So it was very small, it was very dark. So this cabin that we saw at the park would have been really luxurious. It was made of wood. It had 3 windows. They have glass in the windows now. I don't know if they would have had glass windows back then, so you might have had to close the shutters when the weather was bad. But it was so much lighter than a sod house would have been, you know, and they had like a cast iron stove in there as opposed to having to cook on a fireplace. So it was like they had lots of luxuries. And it's interesting to think of the things that would have been luxuries at that time compared to what's a luxury now. And things that we take for granted now, like hot and cold running water at the turn of a knob, are things that they would have found like just hard to imagine. Such things would have been so wonderful. And so homesteading, actually, the Homestead Act was in effect in this country, in at least some parts of the country, up until the 1970s. For the last 20 years or so, like, you could only homestead in Alaska. That was the only place you could still do it under the Homestead Act. And not many people did it then, but it wasn't until much more recently than I realized, and then many people realized, there were places in the U.S. where you could still homestead. It was places where the land wasn't so good and it would be much harder to make a living. Today, when we talk about homesteading, people usually aren't talking about the Homesteading Act. They're talking about being as self-sufficient as possible, like providing for as many of their needs as possible. So they're growing food, they're raising chickens or other livestock, they're cooking things by scratch, maybe they're sewing their own clothes, maybe they have solar panels or something instead of electricity. It kind of varies, and I sometimes use the word apartment steading, which is a little bit silly, but, you know, because I'm in an apartment, but I'm still trying to do as much of that self-sufficient, you know, produce my own things, bake my own bread, you know, do things by hand as I can, which you're limited in what you can do when you're in an apartment. But kind of the theory behind it is still there. It's that you want to be able to meet your own needs and not be reliant on whether it's the government or just businesses or the economy of the country. And that sounds kind of odd too when I say like not be reliant on the government when I'm on disability, which, you know, is through Social Security. Although I paid into that when I worked, but it doesn't, trying to be as self-reliant as possible doesn't mean that you can be totally self-reliant, because I don't think anybody can do that these days. So it means you do what you can. And there are things like food stamps or disability or Social Security or whatever that are there for a reason, and we've all paid taxes to have those things available, and there's no shame in relying on those if you need them. You use them if you need them, that's why they're there. But we can still do as much as we can on our own and learn skills to do things ourselves. Like, there are things that our grandparents and great-grandparents knew how to do, like everybody used to know how to bake bread. Everybody knew how to sew. Everybody knew how to hunt. Things that people used to know how to do that we don't know how to do now. And there's value in learning those skills. Anyway, so that's what Isaac and I did on Thanksgiving, and it gave me lots to think about. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about homesteading. Also, let me know what you did for Thanksgiving. I hope everyone's having a good weekend. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and everybody have a great day.